The scanner screamed, a digital shriek that shattered the afternoon routine like a bullet through glass. Then came the silence, heavy and wrong, the kind that preceded disasters. In that frozen moment, as the emblem on her identification card erupted into cold blue fire, 3 security guards discovered what fear tasted like. Their laughter died in their throats, choked off as if invisible hands had wrapped around their windpipes. Sarah Mitchell's weathered hand remained steady on the counter, while around her, reality itself seemed to bend. The fluorescent lights flickered and dimmed. Every screen in the security station went black, then blazed to life with symbols none of them recognized. Ancient-looking glyphs that hurt to look at directly. The head of security, Derek Chapman, felt his knees buckle as primal recognition flooded his nervous system. He'd heard whispers about this in the darkest corners of military intelligence, stories that ended with, and then everyone involved was reassigned to Antarctica. The kind of clearance that didn't just outrank generals, it made them disappear. How did this woman in a faded cardigan, this nobody who looked like she sold insurance part-time, possess identification that was making the building's entire security infrastructure genuflect like a peasant before an empress? The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Arlington had weathered everything from Vietnam protests to post-9/11 paranoia, but nothing had prepared it for what walked through its doors at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon that would become legend. Sarah Mitchell looked like the human equivalent of background noise. 43 years old, with natural blonde hair invaded by silver, she possessed the kind of face that surveillance cameras forgot to record. Her outfit screamed suburban mundanity, jeans that had survived too many wash cycles, a cardigan that might have witnessed a Carter administration, and shoes that prioritized arch support over any aesthetic consideration. Yet beneath this camouflage of ordinariness, something else moved. Her walk wasn't quite right. Too smooth, too controlled, like a apex predator pretending to be prey, each step calculated to appear random, each gesture designed to deflect attention, while her pale blue eyes performed constant trigonometry, calculating angles of attack and escape routes with the unconscious precision of someone who'd survived too many ambushes to ever truly relax. Derek Chapman ruled his security checkpoint like a petty dictator granted dominion over 6 square meters of marble floor. 6 months into his tenure as head of security, he'd developed a taxonomy of veterans that he applied with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested. Category 1, the obvious warriors with their aggressive trucks and unit tattoos. Category 2, the damaged ones who shuffled through like ghosts. Category 3, the frauds and exaggerators trying to milk a system they'd never truly served. When Sarah Mitchell joined the queue, Derek's internal sorting algorithm immediately classified her. Military dependent, subcategory, delusional spouse. The way she held her ID suggested uncertainty. Her clothes screamed civilian. Her entire presence whispered mistake. He'd process her rejection with the theatrical flair he'd perfected, another story for his guards about desperate housewives trying to claim their ex-husband's benefits. Next victim, Derek muttered to his subordinates, loud enough to carry but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. The 2 junior guards, Tyler Morrison and Marcus Chen, responded with the synchronized snickers of hyenas who'd found their pack leader. They'd spent the morning crafting increasingly cruel nicknames for the veterans who passed through their checkpoint, a game that helped pass the monotonous hours while inflating their sense of importance. Tyler, 25 and fresh from a failed attempt at police academy, saw this job as a consolation prize. Marcus, even younger and nursing resentment from his military rejection due to flat feet, found satisfaction in wielding power over those who'd achieved what he couldn't. When Sarah stepped forward, they both leaned in like sharks scenting blood in the water. Here was entertainment, a break from routine, a chance to exercise the small cruelties that made them feel significant. "I have a 2:30 appointment with Dr. Harrison," Sarah said. Her voice carried neither submission nor challenge, just the flat, declarative tone of someone stating universal constants. The words were unremarkable, but something in their delivery made the air pressure in the room shift slightly. Derek, lost in his predetermined narrative, missed the warning sign. He plucked her ID from the counter with the exaggerated slowness of someone savoring their moment of authority. The card felt strange in his fingers, too heavy, too warm, as if it contained its own power source. The photo showed a younger Sarah, but the eyes were the same, pale blue infinities that seemed to look through the camera and directly at whoever held the card. Military ID, certainly, but the format was wrong. No unit designation he recognized, no rank insignia that fit standard patterns, just that strange emblem that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Well, Derek announced, his voice pitched to carry throughout the lobby. What do we have here? Another civilian trying to pass off some arts and crafts project as military identification? He held the card up, waving it like evidence in a trial, where he served as judge, jury, and executioner. Several veterans in line shifted uncomfortably. A few recognized the cruelty and remembered their own humiliations at the hands of petty bureaucrats. Others, exhausted by their own battles with the system, simply wanted the line to move. None of them noticed how the temperature in the lobby had dropped 3 degrees, or how the security cameras had all swiveled to focus on the checkpoint without any human command. The scanner's first response should have been Derek's warning. Instead of the familiar cheerful beep and green light, the machine produced a sound like grinding metal mixed with electronic screaming. The display screen cracked, actually cracked, spiderweb fractures, spreading from the center as impossible amounts of data tried to force their way through circuits never designed for such information. Derek jerked his hand back, nearly dropping the card. Behind him, the main security monitor began displaying text in languages that predated modern encryption, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. Tyler's mocking expression melted into confusion. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving to the radio on his belt, as if calling for backup could help against whatever was happening. Technical difficulties, Derek announced, trying to reassert control, even as sweat beaded on his forehead. These new systems, always glitching. He forced a laugh that fooled no one, least of all himself. But his ego, that fragile construct built on 6 months of unchallenged authority, wouldn't let him retreat. He ran the card again, this time with the aggressive swipe of someone trying to prove the universe wrong through sheer force of will. The scanner's response was immediate and terrifying. Every electronic device in a 30-foot radius responded simultaneously. Phones shrieked alerts in languages their owners didn't recognize. The overhead lights strobed in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, and the emblem on Sarah's ID, that innocuous symbol Derek had dismissed as decoration, began to glow with the cold blue fire of a reactor core approaching critical mass. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked. The question was mild, conversational, the tone someone might use to inquire about the weather, but underneath it ran currents of power that made primitive parts of Derek's brain scream warnings. This was the voice of someone who'd asked that same question in interrogation rooms where the Geneva Convention was more suggestion than law. Someone who'd extracted information from people trained to resist everything except what she could bring to bear. Tyler's mockery died mid-formation. Marcus found himself checking exits he'd never noticed before. The veterans in line, especially those with combat experience, recognized something in that tone that made them straighten unconsciously. Prey recognizing a predator who'd chosen, for now, not to hunt. "Ma'am," Derek began, his voice climbing into registers that undermined any authority he might have claimed. "This identification appears to be fraudulent. I'm going to need to see additional documentation, and I'm afraid I'll have to contact military police about potential—" He never finished the threat. Sarah's interruption came not through words, but through presence. A shifting of reality around her that made finishing the sentence physically impossible. When she did speak, each word fell like a hammer on glass, precise and devastating. "Protocol Echo 77, Authorization Scorpion, Actual. You have exactly 60 seconds to correct your mistake before automated systems trigger a base-wide security lockdown that will require Pentagon intervention to resolve." The specificity of her words hit the security team like cold water. Echo 77 wasn't just classified. It was mythical. Spoken of in hushed tones by people with clearances that required yearly polygraphs. Scorpion Actual was worse. That designation belonged to operational commanders of units that didn't exist in any official record. Groups whose missions were so far beyond Black Ops they required their own classification systems. Derek's hands shook as he accessed override protocols he'd only seen once during training, protocols he'd been told he'd never need because those people don't visit VA hospitals. But here she stood, patience evaporating like morning dew under nuclear heat, and the building itself seemed to hold its breath waiting for his next move. The security station transformed into something from a techno-thriller nightmare. Monitors flickered through authentication levels that climbed like a launching rocket. Secret flashed by in milliseconds. Top secret barely registered. Then came classifications Derek had never seen. Umbra, gamma, designations in alphabets that predated modern encryption, and finally, a simple word that made his blood freeze. Absolute. The phone at his station began ringing with a tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed the ears and appeared directly in the brain. Derek's subordinates backed away as if the phone itself was radioactive. In a sense, it was. Radioactive, with the kind of authority that ended careers, destroyed lives, and made people disappear into psychiatric facilities where they spent their remaining days insisting they'd seen impossible things. "Answer it," Sarah suggested, and though her tone remained conversational, everyone heard the steel underneath. Derek's hand moved without conscious volition, drawn to the receiver by forces beyond simple obedience. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. Entities at that level of power never did. They simply were, like gravity or death, fundamental forces that shaped reality through their existence. What followed was less conversation than systematic destruction. Each response from Derek revealed another layer of his catastrophic miscalculation. "No, sir. I wasn't aware Project Scorpion maintained domestic operations." "Yes, sir. She did present identification." "No, sir. I chose to dismiss it based on her appearance." "Yes, sir. I understand the security implications." "No, sir. I was not aware that detaining Tier 1 assets constitutes an act of treason under the Patriot Act's classified provisions." The lobby had gone cemetery quiet, every person present recognizing the sound of a man watching his life disintegrate in real time. But their attention was really on Sarah, who stood with the patience of someone who'd waited in far worse places for far more important things. If she felt any satisfaction watching Derek's public humiliation, it didn't show. Her expression suggested she'd witnessed too many deaths, ended too many threats, carried too many secrets to find joy in one man's bureaucratic destruction. She looked tired, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd given everything to a country that thanked her by making her prove her worth to a glorified mall cop. The irony wasn't lost on those watching. She'd probably saved lives in this very building through actions they'd never know about. And her reward was being mocked by someone whose greatest achievement was a perfect attendance record? When Derek finally hung up, his face had achieved a shade of gray typically reserved for corpses. His eyes moved to Sarah's ID still lying on the counter, the holographic emblem now pulsing with a rhythm that matched his accelerated heartbeat. With hands that trembled like an addict in withdrawal, he accessed databases that required biometric confirmation just to view. Sarah Mitchell's service record materialized on his screen, and what little wasn't redacted made him physically ill. 22 years of service across 6 continents, operations in countries that didn't officially exist, commendations written in languages designed to be forgotten, kill confirmations that numbered in the triple digits, and everywhere, that same symbol that now burned on her ID. The mark of Project Scorpion, a unit so classified that its existence was itself a state secret. "Ma'am," Derek's voice cracked like a teenager's. Agent Mitchell, I apologize for..." Words failed him. "How did you apologize for treating an apex predator like a house cat? How did you take back mockery directed at someone who'd probably forgotten more about violence than he'd ever know?" His subordinates had pressed themselves against the back wall, trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. Tyler looked like he might vomit. Marcus was openly crying, though whether from fear or shame was unclear. The entire security station had become a monument to the danger of assumptions, a real-time lesson in why appearances meant nothing in a world where the most dangerous people cultivated invisibility as a survival trait. "I've been strip-searched by Taliban warlords who showed more professionalism," Sarah observed, her tone conversational but somehow worse than screaming. "At least they had the excuse of considering me an enemy combatant. You're supposedly on the same side." The comparison hung in the air like poison gas, its implications clear and devastating. Here, in a facility dedicated to serving those who'd served, she'd received worse treatment than from people who'd actively tried to torture her to death. And she'd survived those people. The unspoken question, what did that say about Derek's life expectancy? Made everyone present reconsider their proximity to the unfolding drama. Several veterans quietly moved toward exits, recognizing the precursor signs of violence in the way Sarah's hands had shifted position, now resting in configurations that suggested rapid movement capabilities. The main entrance exploded open with enough force to crack the reinforced glass. Base Commander Harrison entered like a natural disaster in uniform, his presence immediately reordering the lobby's power dynamics. Career military, from his ramrod spine to his thousand-yard stare, Harrison was the kind of leader who'd earned respect through decades of decisions that kept people alive. His eyes swept the scene with tactical precision. Derek's disintegration, the terrified guards, the silent crowd, and Sarah standing at the epicenter, with the calm of someone who'd weathered far worse storms. Without hesitation, he crossed directly to her, and in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd ordered airstrikes and lived with the consequences, he spoke words that would echo through the facility's history forever. "Mitchell," he said, and the title carried weight. Not former, not retired, but active, present tense, operational. "On behalf of the United States military and every soul you've saved through your service, I apologize for this treatment. Project Scorpion has bled more for this country than most operations were allowed to acknowledge. Your team's actions in Operation Nightshade alone prevented a biological attack that would have killed millions." He paused, letting the number sink in. Millions, not thousands, not hundreds, but millions of American lives balanced against whatever classified horror Sarah and her team had faced in places without names. His gaze moved to Derek, with the precision of a sniper acquiring a target, including Sergeant Chapman, a convoy ambush in Kandahar, August 14, 2011. "Your sister Sarah was in that convoy. She came home because Agent Mitchell and her team decided that protecting American military families was worth burning their entire operational cover. They saved 43 people that day, destroyed 16 years of deep cover work, and lost 3 operators in the process. Your sister lived because heroes you mocked chose her life over their own safety." The revelation hit Derek like a physical blow, stealing what little color remained in his face. His sister had told him about that day, about the ambush that had come from nowhere, perfectly coordinated to maximize casualties. She'd described the mysterious forces that had appeared at the last possible second, operators who'd moved like deadly ghosts through the kill zone, systematically eliminating threats with a precision that suggested years of preparation. The official report had been sanitized beyond recognition, credited to Coalition Quick Reaction Forces. But Sarah, his Sarah, sweet Sarah who'd cried for a week after coming home, had whispered about a woman who'd appeared at her vehicle window, blonde hair visible beneath tactical gear, who'd smiled and said, "Stay down, we've got this," before disappearing into a firefight that sounded like the world ending. That woman stood before him now, and he'd laughed at her service. "Commander," Sarah acknowledged with a micro nod that suggested entire conversations in its brevity. "I'm just here for my appointment. The shrapnel from Marrakech is migrating again." The casual mention of Marrakech, site of an incident so classified it didn't officially exist, added another layer to the growing legend. Shrapnel migration meant metal moving through tissue, seeking vital organs, with the patience of geological time. It meant living with enemy ordnance still trying to complete its mission years after the battle ended. It meant pain that never stopped, merely fluctuated between unbearable and manageable. Commander Harrison's expression tightened with something between rage and sorrow. "Of course. Dr. Harrison cleared his schedule when he heard you were coming, but perhaps we could arrange for private..." Again, that subtle gesture, polite but absolute. Sarah Mitchell had not come for VIP treatment or special recognition. She'd come for medical care, nothing more, nothing less. "I'll wait with the others," she said simply. "Every person in this room has earned their place in line. Their service matters as much as mine." With movements that suggested barely restrained lethality, she retrieved her ID from the counter. The holographic emblem's glow faded like a sleeping dragon closing its eyes. Returning to its dormant state of unremarkable ordinariness, she turned and walked to the waiting area, each step measured and precise, choosing a seat between an elderly Marine whose Parkinson's tremor spoke of Agent Orange exposure, and a young woman whose thousand-yard stare suggested stories too fresh to tell. Just another veteran among veterans, distinguished only by the circle of absolute silence that surrounded her like a force field. The lobby remained frozen in tableau for several heartbeats, everyone present trying to process what they'd witnessed. Then, like ice breaking in spring, conversations resumed, but transformed. Veterans who'd spent years hiding their service behind walls of silence began to speak. The elderly Marine mentioned a night operation in Cambodia that had never appeared in any history book, where figures in unmarked uniforms had materialized to extract his unit from certain death. The young woman spoke haltingly about a classified drone operation where her target had suddenly exploded before she could fire, saved by an intervention she'd never understood until now. Others joined the chorus, sharing fragments of service that didn't fit public narratives, operations that existed in the shadows, between acknowledgement and denial. The atmosphere transformed from bureaucratic purgatory into something approaching a confessional, where sins were replaced by secrets and absolution came through shared understanding. Derek watched this transformation from behind his desk, his entire worldview undergoing tectonic reconstruction. Everything he'd believed about power, authority, and service was being rewritten, in real time, by people he'd dismissed as irrelevant. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where his resignation letter waited, written that morning not because of this incident, but because he'd grown bored with what he saw as a meaningless job. Now he understood he'd been guardian at the gates of Valhalla and had spat on the warriors seeking entry. The letter would still be submitted, but for entirely different reasons. He was no longer worthy of his position, had perhaps never been worthy, had treated sacred ground like a playground for his ego. The realization brought a physical nausea that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with shame so profound it felt like dying. Commander Harrison remained for exactly 7 minutes. He'd know the precise duration, filing it in whatever report this incident would generate. His presence radiated threat assessment, calculating which heads would roll and how far the blood would splash. Before leaving, he stopped at Sarah's seat and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Observers noted several things: Sarah's micro-expressions, cycling through surprise, sorrow, and something that might have been gratitude. Harrison's hand briefly touching her shoulder, the gesture speaking of shared burdens and mutual respect. And most tellingly, Sarah Mitchell's eyes, those pale blue infinities filling with tears she didn't allow to fall. Then Harrison was gone, taking with him the overt reminder of power, but leaving behind consequences that would ripple through time like dropped stones in still water. The facility's intercom crackled to life with the immediacy of emergency broadcasting. But instead of alarm codes or evacuation orders, an automated voice began reading new protocols with the flat affect of machine consciousness. Effective immediately, all security personnel would undergo recertification in identification procedures, with emphasis on classified designation recognition, mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, focusing on the reality that service took many forms, most of them invisible to public knowledge, a zero-tolerance policy for mockery, dismissal, or disrespect toward any veteran, regardless of appearance or demeanor. The changes Derek's cruelty had triggered would reshape the institution for decades, his legacy transformed from minor authority to major cautionary tale. Every new employee would hear about the day someone laughed at Project Scorpion and learned why shadows have teeth. Tyler approached Sarah's position with the tentative steps of someone crossing a minefield in the dark. In his trembling hands, coffee sloshed dangerously close to spilling. Not the bitter brew from the lobby machine, but actual coffee from the staff's private stash, a liquid apology worth more than words. "Ma'am," he began, his voice stripped of everything except naked shame. "What I said, what we did, there's no excuse. We dishonored your service and—" He trailed off, recognizing the futility of words when actions had spoken so clearly. Sarah looked up from her book, a worn paperback about quantum mechanics, because of course someone who'd lived in the spaces between physics and violence would find comfort in uncertainty principles. Her expression held no anger, but something in her gaze made Tyler understand his insignificance in ways that would haunt him forever. "Every person in this room has bled for something greater than themselves," Sarah said, her voice carrying without effort or volume. "Some bled in jungles, some in deserts, some in offices where paper cuts could end the world. Your job, your only job, is to honor that blood by treating everyone who walks through those doors as if they might have saved your life. Because odds are, someone in this room has, through actions you'll never know about, in places that don't exist, fighting enemies you can't imagine." She paused, letting the weight settle, even when they look like someone's grandmother. Especially then, because the best operators, the ones who survive longest, are the ones nobody notices until it's too late. Tyler nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. He set the coffee on the small table beside her chair with the careful reverence of placing flowers on a grave. For the rest of his shift, and for every shift thereafter until retirement 30 years later, he would treat every ID with the possibility it might glow with hidden fire. He would share the story with new hires, each telling emphasizing different lessons: the danger of assumptions, the price of arrogance, the reality that heroes wore camouflage of normalcy. His grandchildren would hear about the day he learned that warriors could look like anyone, and by then the story would have grown into legend, but at its core would remain the truth. He'd mocked someone who'd saved lives beyond counting, and learned why humility was not just virtue, but survival trait. The afternoon crawled toward evening with the weighted pace of paradigm shifts. Sarah's name was eventually called, and she rose with the fluid grace of someone whose body remained weapon despite decades of damage. As she walked toward the medical wing, something unprecedented happened. One by one, every veteran in the waiting room stood, not the rehearsed rising of military ceremony, but the spontaneous acknowledgement of recognized royalty. The elderly Marine managed to lock his trembling into temporary stillness. The young woman with the 1,000-yard stare found focus in the present, long enough to offer a nod that said, "I see you," in the language of shared trauma. Even the desk staff, those who'd witnessed the afternoon's drama from safe distances, found themselves straightening in unconscious salute to something greater than rank or regulation. Sarah paused at the doorway leading to the medical wing, turned, and surveyed the room with those pale blue eyes that had seen too much. For a moment, the mask slipped. The weight of years spent in shadows, the toll of violence, authorized and unauthorized, the price of being weapon and woman simultaneously, all of it showed in the microscopic slump of shoulders that had carried classified burdens across continents. Then she nodded, once, acknowledging their acknowledgement, validating their validation. The gesture lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It changed lives. Veterans who'd spent years questioning their worth, doubting their service because it didn't match Hollywood narratives, found absolution in that nod. If someone who'd operated at levels beyond their imagination could see them as equals, perhaps their own sacrifices mattered after all. She disappeared into the medical wing, leaving behind a lobby transformed into impromptu group therapy. Stories emerged that had been buried under years of "you wouldn't understand," and "it's classified," and "nobody would believe me anyway." The Marine talked about a village in Vietnam where children had been saved by operators without patches or identification. Ghosts who'd prevented a massacre and vanished before thanks could be given. The young woman described drone footage going dark just before a strike. Targets neutralized by forces that didn't appear on any tactical display. Missions completed by people who didn't exist. Each story was different, but patterns emerged. Shadows with purpose, ghosts with guns, saviors without names. And in retrospect, many remembered a detail previously dismissed. Blonde hair visible beneath tactical gear, pale eyes scanning for threats. A woman's voice saying, "We've got this," before impossible things happened. At the security desk, Derek composed his resignation with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The letter was brief, professional, and contained none of the self-pity that might have infected it hours earlier. He acknowledged his failure, accepted responsibility, and recommended Tyler for his replacement. Not because Tyler was qualified, but because Tyler had learned the lesson fastest. As he wrote, Derek's phone buzzed with a message from his sister. She was coming to visit next month, wanted to have dinner, catch up on life. He stared at her contact photo. Sarah in uniform, smiling despite the dust and exhaustion of deployment, and wondered how many times Project Scorpion had saved her, without anyone knowing. How many times had Sarah Mitchell, or someone like her, stood between his sister and death, invisible guardian angels armed with classified weapons and authority beyond comprehension. As the sun began its descent toward the Arlington skyline, painting the city in shades of amber and regret, Sarah Mitchell emerged from the medical wing. Her appointment had been routine by her standards. Adjustment of medications designed for injuries that didn't officially exist, discussion of pain management for wounds that couldn't be documented, the surreal normalcy of living with fragments of enemies still trying to kill her from inside her own body. She moved through the lobby with the same understated presence that had allowed her entry hours before, but everything had changed. Every eye tracked her movement, not with celebrity fascination, but with a deeper recognition reserved for those who'd earned respect through trials beyond imagination. The quality of attention was different. Less staring, more acknowledgement, the way ancient peoples might have watched their gods walk among them in mortal form. She paused at the security desk where Marcus now stood alone, Derek having left immediately after submitting his resignation, fleeing the scene of his humiliation like a criminal leaving evidence. The young guard straightened, fear and respect warring for dominance in his expression. Sarah reached into her bag, the movement causing Marcus to flinch, muscle memory from the afternoon's revelations, and withdrew a simple business card. Nothing fancy, just a phone number and a single word: redemption. She placed it on the counter with the deliberate care of someone handling explosives. "For Derek," she said simply, "tell him that failure is only permanent if you stop learning from it. That number connects to people who can teach him what service really means. He has 72 hours to decide if he wants to earn back the honor he threw away today." It was more than mercy. It was opportunity. The kind of second chance that operators like Sarah rarely received, extended to someone who deserved nothing but had potential for everything. Marcus took the card with trembling fingers, recognizing the weight of what he'd been asked to convey. Derek would call, of course. Pride would war with desperation. But eventually the need to atone would overcome the fear of further humiliation. He would begin a journey that would lead him through training designed to break down arrogance and rebuild character. Programs run by people who'd learned the hard way that assumptions killed more effectively than bullets. In 5 years, he would return to veteran services transformed, spending the remainder of his career ensuring no one experienced what he'd inflicted. Sarah Mitchell's revenge, delivered not through destruction, but through forced growth. The automatic doors parted for her exit, afternoon light streaming through to create a halo effect that seemed almost staged. Outside, the world continued its relentless spin. Traffic moved along Columbia Pike with the urgency of people who had no idea how close they'd come to biological annihilation, saved by operators they'd never know existed. Pedestrians hurried past, absorbed in concerns that seemed simultaneously trivial and vital, the luxury of normal life preserved by abnormal sacrifice. Sarah Mitchell merged with this flow, her specialized training allowing her to disappear between one blink and the next, just another middle-aged woman heading home, invisible in her ordinariness, carrying secrets that would die with her and scars that would outlive her. But for those who'd witnessed the afternoon's revelation, she would never be invisible again. They would see her shadow in every quiet veteran, every unassuming person who moved just a little too smoothly, every pair of eyes that saw too much while revealing nothing. The ripples of that afternoon spread outward in patterns that chaos theorists would have found fascinating. Derek Chapman made the call within 6 hours, beginning a journey that would strip away everything he thought he knew about strength and rebuild him from components of humility and service. Tyler Morrison became a legend within the VA system, known as the security supervisor, who treated every veteran like they might be carrying nuclear launch codes, because one day, one had been. Marcus Chen used his experience to develop new training protocols, creating programs that emphasized respect as the default rather than something earned through proof. The young woman with the 1,000-yard stare finally found courage to seek treatment for trauma that didn't fit conventional categories. Her therapy funded by a mysterious benefactor who knew something about carrying classified wounds. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the institution itself. The VA Medical Center became known as a place where all service was honored, where the quiet ones received the same respect as those whose medals clinked when they walked. Staff learned to see beyond surfaces, to recognize that the most dangerous person in any room was rarely the one who looked the part. They understood now that heroes came in all forms, that classified service had left its agents scattered through society like seeds of secret gardens, blooming only when threatened. The building itself seemed to remember, its walls carrying the echo of that Tuesday afternoon when assumptions died and truth glowed blue. Security scanners were updated with new protocols, but more importantly, the people operating them were updated with new understanding. Project Scorpion remained classified, its operations buried in files that would require presidential authority to access. Sarah Mitchell continued her quiet existence, appearing for her quarterly appointments, each time treated with the respect that should have been automatic from the beginning. She never spoke of her service beyond what was necessary for medical treatment, never sought the recognition that would have been hers with a single phone call. But in that facility, she had become more than a person. She had become a principle. Her story, told in whispers and warnings, reminded every new employee that respect was not negotiable, that service came in forms beyond imagination, and that the person you mocked today might be the reason you were alive to mock anyone at all. The scanner at the VA Medical Center still occasionally erupted in that distinctive blue glow when certain IDs passed through. Staff who'd been properly trained knew what it meant, knew to treat those bearers with particular care. But they also learned to extend that same courtesy to everyone, understanding now that classified service was just the visible tip of an iceberg of sacrifice. They knew that heroes walked among them daily, disguised in the most ordinary appearances, asking for nothing more than basic dignity. Some wore their service on their sleeves. Others wore it in their bones, in metal fragments that shifted with weather changes, in memories that couldn't be shared without violating oaths that bound tighter than family ties. All deserved honor. All deserved respect. All deserved better than Derek Chapman had given, and all would receive better going forward. Time passed, as it inevitably does, but some moments transcend its flow. New staff replaced old. New veterans joined the streams passing through those automatic doors. New stories accumulated, like sediment in the institutional memory. But the legend of Sarah Mitchell persisted, growing perhaps in the telling, but never losing its essential truth. Somewhere in Arlington, a woman in a faded cardigan continued her quiet life, her service to her country measured not in public accolades, but in prevented catastrophes, in millions who lived because she and her team had chosen to exist in shadows, where violence was currency and anonymity was armor. She needed no recognition beyond what that glowing emblem had briefly revealed. She was, and had always been, exactly what she appeared to be. A simple woman whose simplicity was its own form of warfare, whose ordinary appearance was tactical advantage in wars the public would never know were being fought. The lesson of Sarah Mitchell was written now in institutional DNA, passed from employee to employee like genetic memory. Don't judge books by covers because some covers were designed by intelligence agencies to be overlooked. Don't assume that service could be measured by obvious markers, because the most crucial operations left no traces. Don't believe that true power announced itself, because the most dangerous predators evolved perfect camouflage. And always, always treat every veteran with the respect their service had earned, because you never knew who had stood between civilization and chaos, who had bled in places that didn't exist, who had saved lives in numbers that required scientific notation to express. The quiet ones especially, the ones who looked like they belonged in library reading rooms rather than combat zones. Those were the ones who'd survived longest, accomplished most, and asked for least. As another day ended at the VA Medical Center, the security desk stood ready for the next shift. The protocols had changed, the training had evolved, but more importantly, the culture had transformed. Each ID scanned was a potential gateway to impossible stories. Each veteran who approached was treated with the working assumption that they might have saved the world before breakfast and would never mention it. The scanner waited patiently, its circuits upgraded to handle classification levels that shouldn't exist, ready to glow blue when necessary, but hoping it would never need to again, because in a perfect world, respect would be given freely. Service would be honored automatically, and no one would need to reveal classified identities to receive basic human dignity. The blue light had faded from the lobby, but not from memory. It lived now in the space between assumption and reality, a cautionary tale told in orientation sessions and whispered in break rooms. It reminded everyone that in a world of surface judgments and shallow assessments, truth had a way of illuminating itself when necessary, and that illumination could destroy careers, shatter worldviews, and rebuild entire institutions. Sarah Mitchell had done all three in a single afternoon, not through intention but through existence, not through revenge but through revelation. Her presence had been catalyst for change that would outlive everyone who'd witnessed it, ensuring that future veterans would walk through those doors into an environment shaped by her shadow. For those who truly understood service, no glowing emblems were necessary. They recognized their own kind in the quality of silence, in the economy of movement, in the patient endurance of those who'd learned that respect was nice, but survival was necessity. They knew that true warriors rarely looked the part in civilian life, that the most dangerous people in any room were often the ones reading paperback books about quantum mechanics, and that every person who'd served deserved recognition, regardless of whether their service could be discussed in public. Sarah Mitchell had taught them that through demonstration rather than lecture, through dignity rather than demands, through the simple act of existing in a space where her existence challenged every preconception. The story ends where it began, with a simple woman and a simple ID card that turned out to be neither. But the complexity was never the point. The point was that every veteran who walked through those doors carried stories worth respecting, whether those stories were classified beyond imagination or simply the quiet heroism of showing up and serving. Every ID represented a life transformed by choice. A person who decided that something mattered more than personal safety. And sometimes, when arrogance met reality in the form of a glowing blue emblem, the universe provided a reminder that heroes walked among us daily, disguised in the most ordinary appearances, asking for nothing more than the basic respect their service had earned. Sarah Mitchell had been that reminder. delivered with devastating precision to people who'd forgotten that assumption was the most dangerous enemy of all. The lesson lingered long after she'd gone, encoded now in institutional memory and personal nightmares alike. Honor all who served, for you never know whose quiet presence might hide world-saving sacrifice. Treat every veteran with dignity, for their stories might be written in languages so classified the alphabets themselves were secret. And remember always that true power never needed to announce itself. It simply existed, patient as gravity, waiting for the moment when someone's ignorance demanded education. That was the gift Sarah Mitchell left behind. Not the shock of her revelation, but the understanding that every veteran deserved the respect she had finally received. In a building dedicated to healing those who'd served, she had provided the deepest healing of all, the recognition that service came in many forms, that heroes wore many faces, and that, sometimes, the most profound revenge was forcing people to grow beyond their limitations into something worthy of the sacrifices made on their behalf.